Welcome to Christian Conversations with Strathern United Church. In today's lecture, Reverend Sandy will be talking about the history, role, and significance of music in the Christian faith. We hope that you'll enjoy this opportunity to listen, learn, and reflect. Thank you for joining us.
Well, hello. Whenever you're joining us here at Strathern on our YouTube video, and this is the lecture part, and we're talking about music and faith as part of the worship experience. Let's just start with a moment of prayer. God, you give us the gift of music, the gift that can touch our souls, reveal new parts of who you are in our lives. We sing as a choir, we sing in the congregation, or we sing in ourselves. Never still the song in our hearts, O God. Continue to invite us to sing as we sing your praises. Amen. So I'm going to the usual format. I will give some background, some reflection on scripture, some historical context, and some of my own personal kind of aspects in all of this. I'm just going to start with a personal anecdote. In my last church, I was asked to do a funeral, and it was quite an intense situation. The family had said to me that they did not want any specific mention of God during the memorial service, and so I was willing to work with that. And so we discussed with the family what the service would look like in that kind of context, like music, and what kind of liturgy we would use. And in course of the conversation, I discovered that the deceased had been a great lover of the works of J.R.R. Tolkien. And I kind of leapt on that. And I was invited. So I invited the family to allow me to read from a piece of J.R.R. Tolkien's work, The Silmarillion. And in the Silmarillion, there is a description of how the world of Middle-earth is created. Now, I think it's very important to remember that J.R.R. Tolkien was a devout Christian. He was a devout member of the Catholic Church. He was actually involved in translating parts of one of the Catholic translations of the Bible. And so, much of his work is infused by his faith. And so he created this narrative of the creation of the world that Middle-earth is part of. And how this was done was Iru Iluvata, God, and the Ainur, the angels, the heavenly host, they sing a great song. And through this song, the themes of the creation are intertwined. You hear the description, it's just absolutely wonderful as Tolkien talks of the musical themes within creation of the elves, creation of the men, children of the stars, still children of the suns, I sometimes use that phrase. The conflicts, it's a wonderful piece because it describes the choir. And I've always taken this, the themes of creation with the courses of the Ainur, with the moments of connection and discordance as a wonderful image of the power of music and creation itself. So that has stuck with me. There's an interesting kind of sequel to that moment. When I read this passage as part of the memorial service, a few months later, a member of the congregation was organizing an event in one of the towns, and they asked if I would read this piece of music in the background of someone dancing with balls of fire. I am not joking. They had these on chains, as it was kind of like, I don't know what you would call them, but they had fire from them, and she was waving them around, and I'm reading this for my dear life, kind of like keeping away from the fire. So, right. Anyway, so personal line. Music has always been part of the human relationship with the divine. We can't say for sure when it started, we are talking, um, you can't, when you don't have written history, you can't know when people started to sing. We can maybe do some, I don't know, or maybe do some kind of evidence in terms of vocal cords and what fossil remains we have. The only evidence that we can have of music as part of the human condition is from musical instruments. Many musical instruments don't survive. If you might have drums made out of animal skin, that's not going to survive. You may have shakers and rackers filled with seeds and whatever. That's not going to survive. The oldest musical instrument possibly dates back to 43,000 years ago, with the discovery of what some people believe to be bone flutes, and bones of animals with holes. The bones have been hollowed out and the holes have been carved in, and then you have a flute. So we have no idea what they were used for. Ritual, the kind of the ongoing running joke, if an archaeologist can't explain what it's for, it's always for ritual. It could be for some kind of ritual, it could be for personal. We can never underestimate people's desire to entertain themselves. And the sound of music must have been a wondrous thing, like the ability to create sound that was not just part of the regular day-to-day life, something that you yourself were creating through the medium of this flute and your breath. And just think about the imagery there. The breath, making music. We talk about breathing life into creation. Maybe that's an early. I don't know. I'm just throwing that out. Because I've got the platform, as it were. So we have no idea. We have no idea of the remembrances of those days. What kind of we could assume that people told stories, they sung songs. They wouldn't be able to remember the songs because they couldn't write. Well, they could remember them, but they couldn't write them down. So the songs would change. The songs would change to reflect what was going on. So it was a living, breathing culture that we can only speculate. One thing we can do is we can look at similar societies today, are the records of similar societies and how they talked about music. And we hear about music being used for a whole variety of things. One thing this just occurred to me this morning. I thought this is kind of wonderful, this kind of continuity. And one of the things that music was often used for was the background for telling a story. And I'll be talking about this later on because we do have historical evidence of bards who would tell a story either in form of a song, or they would tell the story and play an instrument that would be at the backdrop. And just this morning, it occurred to me, we still do that. We do it in a very different way. We do, thanks to technology, we have a very different method of doing it. But the next time you watch a TV show or a movie, notice the soundtrack. Now, I love soundtracks. It was one of my favorite genres of music, and classic. And think about the power of a soundtrack and how it can add or subtract if the soundtrack doesn't work, how it can add or subtract to the telling of the story. And then reflect that this is what we've been doing for thousands of years. The technology has changed. The ability to add music to how we tell our stories has changed, but we're still doing it. We still feel that music is an important way of telling a story. And I'll be talking more about that later. So, music we can see as part of a variety of rituals. You sing songs to proclaim a new season. You use music to scare away the devils and demons and all this kind of stuff. There's a whole variety of things. And building the community together, joint musical effort, singing a song, whatever. So there's a whole bunch of bits and pieces. When we started the path towards building agricultural societies, settled societies, towns, villages, cities, hierarchical structures, organized religion, and literacy, music there's first of all, there's more evidence for music. We have more clear evidence of the importance of music in our societies. and humanity, and how music is part of humanity's relationship with the divine. Records from the first urban civilizations, Sumer, dating back thousands of years. I always like to throw this one out. Ancient Sumer was around, 10, 15, yeah, 10, yeah, probably more, 10,000 years ago. And one of my favorite jokes is about when they came up with the idea of the world was created 4000 BC. And someone actually said the date. And the running joke is ancient Sumerians noticed the world's being created around them going, wait a second, we were already here. But that's another, I'm digressing. Anyway, back to Sumer. Sumer in present day Iraq, we have records where they mention paid musicians that were attached to various temples using a variety of instruments, mainly flutes, drums, and harps. We have records of various hymns, liturgies that were sung to honor the gods throughout the whole Mediterranean and Near East world and beyond. I confess that my knowledge of history is usually the ancient Near East, the Mediterranean world, but there is records of music being very much part of the ancient Chinese civilization as well. Wonderful instruments have been found made of bronze later on in the way. So all over the world. The earliest hymn devoted to a divine figure, by the name of Nakal, a goddess in that region of the Middle East, dates back to approximately 1400 before Common Era. So that's about 3,500 years ago. And music would play a critical part in the worship. It was formalized. You would have choirs, you would have chants, and it seems that you had to sing the chant in the right way. And if you deviated from the proper way, then you would have to start all over again. You would sing praises to various gods. The ancient Greeks had a whole series of hymns devoted to various of the deities. And one of the evolution of music and part of the worship life of the ancient Greek communities was that they were part of the festivals and the celebration of God. And in time, the music would become part of the drama festivals. Ancient Greek drama, the music is a big component of that. And so, this is something we don't notice this kind of thing. So music, the divine, the life of the community is all intertwined. Another very important part is the role of bards, storytelling. And I've already alluded to this when I talked about soundtracks. It's musicians who would memorize a whole variety of songs. And one of my favorite documentaries is from the 1980s, and it was In Search of the Trojan War, and it talked about a whole variety of aspects. And one thing it talked about was the bard. How the bard can tell stories. They have memories of, they memorize these stories, and the techniques they use to memorize these stories. They play with musical instruments as part of the accompaniment, part of the beat of telling the story. And there were still bards at the time this story of this documentary was out in the 1980s. They may still be there. These bards in various forms and various cultural groups have survived for thousands of years. And they were there in ancient Greece, the Middle East, Britain. He featured an Irish bard, one of the last of his generation. And they would tell the stories of heroes and gods. Now, this wasn't a formal religious experience, but it was a religious experience as a community. I find, and this is one of the distinctions we'll see now and again. You'll have the rigid, formalized chanting in a temple, in a church experience of worship, and then you'll have the ordinary people. How do they connect with the divine through music? They'll make up songs. They'll sing folk songs. They'll talk about the stories of the gods and the end time story of God. And so there's these two parallel tracks of music, kind of formal, rigid, It has to be done right. And the more kind of, ordinary people, let's just sing a good story, let's tell a good tale. So keep that in mind. Music in the Bible. Okay, let's get to the main topic. Where does it fit into our faith? Well, the people of Israel were descended from the people of Canaan, and we know that the people of the city-states of Canaan, which is the land of Israel and Lebanon and Jordan of today, they lived in city-states, small cities scattered throughout the whole region. They had temples, they had literacy, uh, formalized structures of power, the usual setup. And their temples have been found, their temples have been excavated. We have the same kind of evidence of music as part of the worship. We even have little statues of musicians and whatever. And so this was part of the legacy of the people of Israel. And music was very much part of the religious life of the Canaanites. And the people of Israel would follow in that legacy. They would change some of the details and change the topics of some of the songs, instead of multiple. But if you ever read some of the Psalms, you'll notice that some of the Psalms make reference to God amongst the other gods. So there's still that kind of, continuance. One of the most wow moments for me when I was starting to learn more about how Scripture itself was created, how the Bible was written, was the discovery of the various sources, and obviously that's a completely different topic in another way. And I think I've talked about it before as well. But one of the oldest pieces of the Bible that we have, one of the oldest texts, is what is referred to the Song of the Sea from the book of Exodus, chapter 15, verses 1 to 18, and it's also in Voices United as well. It tells of the celebration of the women of Israel for the victory of God over the Egyptians' forces at the Red Sea. It's a celebration of the triumph of God. What is remarkable about this piece is it's probably the oldest text, and scholars can, what they do is they look at how things were written, the style of the language, and they've noticed that the language is written in an archaic form of Hebrew that probably dates back to at least 1,000 years before the birth of Christ. Now, because there's all the spoil sports, some people have said, well, yeah, it was written later by people who copied the style to make it look old. I like to believe the former version, and I personally think there's probably enough evidence to show that this is old. This was written down, and what I mean is this was part of the Bible. This was written down or transmitted for people before the other stories became part of the Bible. And that's, as I said, that's going to be another topic. But the song celebrates the faith of the people of God's willingness to fight for the people in the face of their enemies. And as a song, it describes a pivotal event in the history of the community of Israel. And so the song is important, and it's so important it gets written down, and it's so important it becomes part of the scripture of the people of Israel. And it has a ritual purpose. It would be one of those songs that they would sing as part of the worship life of the community of Israel. I believe it's still sung in synagogues and the like as part of the cycle of music. The Psalms are the tradition of the Psalms is that they were written by David and to reflect various aspects of the spiritual life of David. We can now, it's more complicated, as all these things always are. The Psalms are written over probably 800-year period, beginning probably 1,000 before the birth of Jesus, and the last ones were probably written just a few, maybe 100 or 200 years before the birth of Jesus. So it's an 800-year period. Did David write some of them? Why not? There's nothing wrong to say that he didn't write any of them. We don't know. That's the issue that we have. Some of the Psalms are very personal, intimate prayers. Were they sung or not? Don't know. When they were first written down. Others were written down as obvious pieces of liturgy. Psalm 100 is a very good example of that kind of that vision of the community being welcomed and of God, the community worshiping before God. So we have the Psalms. We have other mentions of music. David, that's another mention of David. David was hired because apparently his musical playing soothed the troubled soul of Saul until one day he didn't, and and Saul tried to kill him. So sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't. One of the things we have in the Psalms itself is we have various words that we're not able to decipher, and Selah is one of them. So when you see Selah in a Psalm, you have to wonder what it is. Kind of the more traditional theory is it's a musical notation of some sort. Don't know what it meant. My personal favorite was the one I read where it's the sound someone makes when their harpstring breaks and they're really annoyed about it. It's like, ah! And happens quite often, but I don't know. But also, let's come back to the bard for a few brief moments. One of the things about many of the stories that we have, particularly in the book of Genesis, is that we believe now that they were part of an oral tradition where stories were shared round the campfire, round the hearth, to be heard by a bunch of people, and the stories were being told by the bard, as I mentioned before. And the bard was paid for their skill. Obviously, in those days they didn't have money, so you didn't hand them over a check or whatever. You would give them hospitality, you would give them a gift, you would allow them to stay for a while and that kind of stuff. And there would be prestige and whatever. But the bard would tell stories and keep the stories of the people alive. Now the stories would change, details would be added, to use the process of the writing of the Iliad and the Odyssey. They would have started off as these oral epics, and the bard would tell the story. They would turn up in a small town, and the small town saying, "We don't have a hero associated with the Trojan War, but we would like one," to use the quote from the In Search of the Trojan War documentary. And the bard, knowing what side their bread was buttered on, would add a story. "Oh, have you heard the story of such and such and such?" And that would have happened around the stories of the people of Israel, of the people who created the tribes and all this kind of stuff. And in time, these stories would be codified. They would be written down. Because they represented a bunch of traditions, sometimes the traditions didn't match. Sometimes there were editorial issues. Sometimes there were timeline issues. But the stories had become so important for the people of Israel that they would be treasured and kept and become part of the story of Israel. So you have once more the personal, the story around the campfire, the music of that setup, and then you would have the kind of the ritual. So I'm just looking. We're going to go straight to Christianity and music. Now there are some mentions in the Gospels and in Paul's writings talk about people singing hymns and praise songs around the Galilee. More likely, as part of the Jewish tradition, they would have sung probably the Psalms in various forms, probably not with musical accompaniment. In time, with the emergence of Christian communities, music would be a big part of how they worship together, and they would be singing the Psalms. That would be the kind of the key part of the worship, right? Now they'd be sung different ways, and there would be kind of more growing influence from the Hellenistic and the Roman style of such music and whatever. Some traditions would use a cantor, someone who would lead the congregation into musical worship. But if you've ever been to a synagogue, or if you've ever been to even like Anglican or Catholic service, you'll notice that sometimes they sing the psalm in kind of alternate ways. And it's an interesting experience when you're a Protestant. It's like, okay. but this is how they've been doing it. You know, this is this is the way. And one of the earliest mentions, interestingly enough, of Christian music is from the letters of Pliny the Younger, who was a Roman official in Turkey, who was looking for advice on how to deal with persecuting Christians, or how to deal with Christians, and should you persecute them, should you leave them alone? And he was a very thorough individual, and so he investigated. And one of the things he talked about is they like to sing hymns as part of their worship, and their hymns dedicated to their God, Christ. So that was like 100, 110 after the birth of Jesus. As the church became more of an institution, the choral singing became more of the norm within the churches, and it became more and more formal, more and more following patterns. Instruments, interesting enough, whenever there was a discomfort about using instruments as part of the process. I think maybe something to do with the purity of the human voice or something like that. Instruments are usually like part of parties, and you don't want to distract people by having a party break out, that kind of stuff. So, chanting. There was a variety of series of chanting. One style was the Ambrosian style of chanting that started about 500 years after the birth of Jesus, 500, 600. And I've listened to Ambrosian chanting. I find it very moving. But the big one is Gregorian chanting. That started around the 9th, the 10th centuries, and it became Europe-wide, Western Europe. So the thing I must kind of keep in mind is a large part of what I'm talking about is Western Europe and North America eventually. I know a little bit about Eastern Orthodox music, and once more, it's very formalized, it's very chanting and such, and I enjoy listening to it. I do like listening to Ambrosian chanting, Gregorian chanting, Eastern Orthodox chanting. There's a beauty, there's a kind of spirituality that it's a little otherworldly as well, though sometimes, and that's something I'll be coming to. So anywho, so Gregorian chanting. Just recently I saw this post on my Facebook, and I kind of joked about how many people remember when there was a time that when Gregorian chanting became really cool and everyone was into it. And there was, it was, I think it was, I can't remember when it was quite a few years ago, but there was even like, it did well in the musical charts and all this kind of stuff. I've listened to Gregorian chant for quite a few years now, before it became cool and trendy. But it was the kind of main Christian music throughout most of the medieval period. And as I said, it was established throughout all of Western Europe as kind of the default mode. So what is Gregorian chanting? Gregorian chanting is part of it. It was music that followed what was referred to as the Roman rite of worship. This was kind of the main liturgical base of the medieval Christian church, the medieval Roman Catholic Church, which is quite different from the present day church. So I always think it's useful to make a distinction. The Roman rite, as was practiced as part of the worship life of the Christian faith. Because in those days, if you were not part of the Roman Catholic Church, you weren't Christian. You could call yourself whatever you like, but as far as Rome is concerned, there was only one church. And this Roman rite was the universal mode of worship. It would follow the liturgical calendar. The music would be part of the Mass. It would all be sung in Latin. The chants, the Gregorian chants would be part of the daily worship life of the various monastic movements and the nunnery movements. And the choirs would sing in various formats every day. They would sing the daily rite of worship and all this kind of stuff. It was very intense, very, orderly in terms of, and it was fairly universal. Wonderful music. As I said, I enjoy listening to Gregorian chanting. I have some albums, and it's nice to be in the office and put it on, or maybe go to the sanctuary and put it on. But um, I have questions, and it comes back to that division I've talked about between kind of the informal and the formal. Um, the the Gregorian chant was very much part of the monastic movement. So ordinary people didn't have that much access to it. The ordinary people would turn up for mass. They would hear the music during that, but much of the music of the service was in Latin. Most people didn't speak Latin. Most people spoke a vernacular form of language, um, Old French, various Old German dialects, Old English, Old Scots, Gaelic, Welsh, whatever. They were not hearing, for the most part, they were not hearing that music in the church. They were hearing beautiful music, well led, these choirs are long established. Like I understand some of the boys' choirs in England date back centuries. And so they were trained, well led, and looked after, and all that. But at the end of the day, what did it mean for people? Like, what did it mean for someone to be listening to this music and maybe not really understand what's going on? But it's religious. It certainly would add to the mystery of God. And so there was a parallel. During the medieval period, there are also examples of what we would call popular Christian music. The origins of some Christmas carols, for example, are date from this period, in that songs sung in the local languages as opposed to Latin. They would be sung at various Christian festivals that would be celebrated beyond the church. So the kind of celebration of Christmas in many places would be not just the mass, but also like the kind of the pagan elements of Christmas, but you'd throw in some Christmas carols while you're at it, like things changed. And so the church authorities were never keen on this because, they like to keep the religion in their terms. And popular religion has never been popular with hierarchies. It's true for both Protestants and Catholics. Like the Catholics may have had more to lose, but it's certainly safe to say that when some of the newer hymns came up in like later traditions, in the Anglican tradition, for example, they were not very popular there either. So, and so bring up Anglicans, it would be the Reformation that would change everything. The Reformation that would change the world of church music and in many ways make it more personal. As I said, there is a spiritual purity amongst much of the chanting, but it's sometimes difficult to engage with that. If it makes sense, it feels like you're listening to the kind of music that makes you think about God, but in a way that you don't feel a connection with God. That majesty of God, that wonder of God, but not much in the way of connection. One critical difference that would happen in the Reformation was the shift away from Latin to the languages of the people. Hymns would now be in French, German, English, Scots, Welsh, other languages. And then there was the music itself. Martin Luther is well known for his belief that if you want to reach out to people, if you want church music to reach out to people, use the music they're familiar with, use the music they like, give them lyrics that make them think about God, but let them enjoy the tune. And so, I'm not sure where the tune of Martin Luther of "A Mighty Fortress from Our God" comes to, but that was a rousing kind of like, and you can almost imagine it like as a pub song, because he did use pub tunes for his hymns. So you can imagine them all sitting in the pub, "A mighty fortress is our God," and like, oh, great stuff, let's go and spread the good news, folks. Other reformers would take a different path, like I remember when I started learning about the Church of Scotland, I didn't grow up in the church, and so I didn't learn much about it until I was probably at university. I may have known some when I was in secondary school, but and to discover just how like, the early Church of Scotland did not like the idea of. In many ways, its attitude towards music was still very formal. The early church congregations of the Church of Scotland would sing a cappella. There'd be no musical accompaniment, and in the beginning, it would be hymns. Psalm 23rd. Crimmins, like I always joke, if it's not Crimmins, it's not Psalm 23. That's not the Lord is my shepherd. It's ingrained in me. Psalm 100, I remember reading about when eventually the Church of Scotland lightened up and allowed other hymns and even, my God, organ music and church piano music. They were people who split away from the Church of Scotland because they weren't having it. The congregation sung the psalms. They didn't have a choir per se. They didn't have anything like that. It was a congregation who would sing the psalms, but there was this idea of hymns, music that might be a bit too much like fun. God forbid, it might even lead to dancing. We all know what happens then. That sense of the purity of the music. And so that tension is still there, as I said, that kind of between the divine majesty of music, I guess, and that personal connection. So, yeah, music becomes a big thing. And one of the kind of interesting, and that's, one of my more notorious stories about music in the church is when I was drafted into a committee to renew the church. And I was, they kind of started, because I was young physically. And so they asked me what kind of music taste did I have? And I said, well, I love Baroque music, particularly Vivaldi and J.S. Bach. The only modern music I listen to is the Eagles. And they were concerned because it was not what they were looking for. But classical music is very much riddled, driven by religious music. And the Baroque period in particular, many of the composers wrote extensive amount of music for the churches they were part of. J.S. Bach wrote a lot of music for the Lutheran churches he served. Antonio Vivaldi was a Roman Catholic priest who preferred being a composer to a priest. And they both wrote vast amounts of sacred music. And some of the pieces I really enjoy. There are various pieces of Bach's music I listen to during the Lenten season because of the passions that they're called. And Mozart, Haydn, Handel all wrote pieces of music. And Handel's a very good example. Handel wrote The Messiah, and one of the things about The Messiah was that it was this grand classical piece of music about religious themes, and choirs of all ilks loved it. And you'd have choirs of the highfalutin and working people in mines and all this kind of stuff who would gather together and sing these pieces because the music spoke. So it was this interesting combination of both the kind of highfalutin we call it highfalutin classical music, but it was speaking to ordinary people. We do the Handel Messiah now and again here at Strathern. It's often a very popular piece for churches, especially some of the choruses, because they're rousing, but we get into it. It speaks to us. Because one thing is we know the words. The words are in English. So I'm kind of just looking at my time frame, and so I'm just going to start wrapping things up a little bit. Christian music would become more reflective of the life of the community. Hymns would be using classical tunes, popular tunes, and would often have themes that were important to people as well. Amazing Grace was written in the 18th century from the experiences of an abolitionist who kind of repented of his link with slavery, and he riddled with his own guilt about grace and his hope and fervent belief in grace. And the tunes would change, interestingly enough. I remember kind of being quite shocked that the first tune that was sung with Amazing Grace was not the one we're familiar with. But, tunes evolve. Sometimes classical tunes can lead to a bit of an interesting shock. years ago when I was in Fort Nelson, and I was part of the Legion service, and the the Remembrance Day service. They didn't have a Legion, and the local school band were playing some of the pieces, and I'm sitting there going like, "Holy mackerel! They're playing the national German national anthem. What the heck?" And I don't think we should be doing. And then I realized the German national anthem is originally music written by Haydn. It was a classical piece that had been borrowed and such and such. So we have all these traditions of music. We're quite a world away from the kind of the purity, as it were, of the Gregorian chant, the kind of the sameness of the Gregorian chant, the kind of God never changing that the Gregorian chant. We have a whole whack of stuff. Lyrics, people wanted lyrics that spoke to them. They wanted to sing a hymn that was meaningful to them. And and today we were looking at kind of period of change. Like one of the things I've noticed in my own experience in the church is music, and I the styles of music. And I'm a bit in an odd situation. Like I'm not a like for instance, I don't like praise and worship music from evangelical churches. I don't like it at all, and I'll be honest about that because I find a lot of it not very. It's quite triumphant, or it's very exclusive. Like one in particular sticks in my mind. My God is an awesome God, and I almost kind of joke about it, kind of say underneath my breath, mutter, and he can kick your butt any day. Kind of that seems to be that mentality. It doesn't speak to me, but it speaks to other people, and so that's one of the challenges we have with hymns. And this is one thing we face in the United Church, and many modern churches. We have understandings of hymns that make us cringe because the lyrics don't speak to us because we're not in that place. And sometimes we forget that they might not speak to you, but they will speak to someone else. Like, I, if I've shared with you, if you've heard this, tell me this story before, do you have permission to nod off for a few moments? During my training as at seminary, I was assigned to Burnside Jail as a chaplain, part-time chaplain. And one of my duties and responsibilities was to be part of the worship services. And so I would be in the room with a whole bunch of inmates, and they would choose the hymns. And the hymn book they used was certainly not Voices United. It was filled with all the kind of the woe is me, I'm a wretched sinner, and all this kind of really heavy, we're worthless worm kind of theology. And I didn't care for it. I didn't like it. And I expressed this to my supervisor. I expressed my discomfort about these hymns, that they weren't United Church enough for my taste. And he explained. He said, these are prisoners. These are people who the world has said are sinners. And many of them believe that. They believe they're wretched. They need music that speaks to them, that they will be forgiven however wretched they are. And that really sunk with me. And it stayed with me, that kind of that lesson, that my understanding of Christian music is shaped by my own experiences, my own tastes, my own desires. And it doesn't necessarily mean I'm right or wrong. I just have a different perspective, and I'm not in those places. The interesting sequel to that was the outside, the churches in the region outside the prison were sometimes invited to do a service. And there was a United Church group who decided to do a service, and they kind of brought along the Voices United, and they brought along the kind of Voices United mindset. And the service didn't, the inmates weren't all that, they weren't as engaged. And afterwards, the group were a little deflated because, we always want to have a good response, don't we? And so they asked me, what did I think had went wrong, as it were? And I just kind of, was polite, and I said, something to the effect of, they weren't familiar with the music. They weren't familiar with the hymns and stuff. The reality was the hymns didn't speak to them. The hymns of Voices United, and especially the hymns they had chosen, were kind of like light, breezy, and didn't meet their needs. There wasn't anything wrong with what they had done. It's just that's how sometimes hymns can speak to you, and sometimes hymns can't speak to you. And I've had those moments. I think most of us had those moments. We've listened to a hymn and it didn't work for us, and I confess I don't read music, so when I look at a hymn, I think it looks great, and then the tune's awful, and I confess to my sins as far as that's concerned. But we do have to recognize, like, there are certain points and certain moments when a church music, a hymn or whatever, can speak to someone so profoundly, and you may be left cold by the experience because you're not in the same place. And it's just a reminder of how music can touch us or not touch us. Because you may hear how great thou art, and one morning you'll be like, oh God, not again. How many verses? Oh no, we're only in verse 3. I've got to go home and see if I've left the oven on. Or, oh God, how great thou art. I really need this. I really need to hear this. I really need to sing this. I can put my, we have our favorite hymns, but sometimes our favorite hymns depend on the spirit that we're in. I Feel the Winds of God to me is one of my favorite hymns, and usually it puts me into a good spirit. And when I'm singing with gusto. If I'm not singing with gusto, I'm kind of like, maybe I need to check in on myself, what's going on. So that's, I hope that gives us some food for thought. I hope it gives us some kind of things to think about in terms of music. One of the challenges we face, and I think one of the things, to come back to the question of praise and worship, one of the biggest, I think, the kind of failings with praise and worship was it was this idea of writing music to kind of make things snappy, make things cool. We can all these chants and whatever. Like I remember when our congregation, when I was a member of the church, not when I was serving as a minister, we decided to go to praise and worship for that reason. Snappy, it was cool. We'd all be jiving around, whatever. And then you look at the words, and that was my moment. That was my road to Damascus conversion. Like, yeah, I'm not doing this ever again, gang. The lyrics were horrible because the lyrics represented what we would call maybe not Christian nationalism. The lyrics can be quite combative, aggressive, exclusive, and that's not what I'm singing. When I personally want to lose my faith, lose myself in my hymns, as it were, I want hymns that are meaningful to me in terms of where I am in the kingdom of God, where I am in my life, where do I feel God is. This idea of using music to kind of attack people, to say our God is better than your God, or you got to be in your bended knee and grovel in the dirt and all this kind of stuff. It doesn't appeal to me. It might appeal to other people, and that's the challenge that we face. And so, my feeling in terms of music in the church, I will say how grateful I am to be here at Strathern, because I think our music is wonderful. I really do appreciate the music, because I feel it does add to the church, the talents that we have, and the playfulness and the seriousness that we have in equal measure. Like, the kind of that sense of music is important, and it's too important, I feel, to be kind of sanctified. What does that mean by that? Isn't that music is a living, breathing thing? It changes. We change. And what was relevant to us a few years ago might not be relevant to us now. And one day may come relevant again when we're ready. So I'm going to wrap up in that kind of last minute rambling. And thank you for listening to someone who loves church music but doesn't know how to do any of it. And please be a little bit more Please be aware that I don't read music, and so if you want to come after me for the tunes, you have every right to do so. I do try and listen. I do try and put them onto the Voices United, and maybe the problem is they sing them so well in Voices United on the on the YouTube. And so, as I said, so I confess to my many sins as far as that's concerned. Anywho, time to wrap up. Thanks again. And let's close with prayer. God, we thank you for the gift of music. It touches our souls, it touches our hearts. You gave us a song to sing. Sometimes it's difficult, sometimes we struggle. But God, be with us as we sing your song. Amen.